Why did Rome's most dangerous wars begin, not on its frontiers, but inside its own system? Why did a set of reforms, born from desperation on foreign battlefields, end up turning the Republic's own army against it? To answer that, we have to return to the late 2nd century BCE, when Rome's military machine, once the pride of the ancient world, faltered under pressure, and a general named Gaius Marius made a choice that changed everything. Picture the Numidian desert in 107 BCE. The sun beats down like a hammer, the wind carries sand that blinds and chokes, and Roman troops stumble forward in weary lines. These are supposed to be the heirs of Scipio Africanus, conqueror of Carthage, but they hardly look like it. The men are underfed, poorly equipped, and badly led. Their armor is pieced together from mismatched scraps, their training inconsistent, their morale crumbling. Rome, victorious across the Mediterranean, suddenly appears fragile. For years, King Jugurtha of Numidia, a thorny, clever opponent with a gift for guerrilla war, has humiliated commander after commander. Each setback chips away at Rome's aura of invincibility. Behind these struggles lurks an even greater fear. To the north, word spreads of entire nations on the move, the Cimbri and the Teutones. Vast columns of tribes with wagons, families, and warriors sweep through Europe like a storm. When they finally smash into Roman forces at Arausio in 105 BCE, the result is annihilation. Perhaps 80,000 Roman soldiers die in a single day, victims of poor leadership in overwhelming numbers. The Republic trembles, remembering Hannibal's dreadful victories, and Romans whisper that their legions might not recover this time. Something is dangerously wrong with the system. The cracks are obvious. For centuries, Rome had relied on the property-owning farmer as its soldier. Service in the legions was tied to landholding. Wars were conducted in seasonal campaigns, after which men returned to their farms. But conquest changed everything. Now Rome's wars lasted for years in faraway provinces. Farmers could not sustain their fields while serving for long stretches abroad. Many never returned, their lands swallowed up by wealthy elites who grew richer with every victory. The Republic's armies, once stocked with sturdy yeoman farmers, now face a manpower crisis. There simply aren't enough qualified citizens left to fill the ranks. Rome is an empire with a hollow core. It is into this crisis that Gaius Marius steps. He is a man defined by his origins. Unlike his aristocratic peers, he is a new man, a novus homo from Arpinum, the same provincial town that would later produce Cicero. Not born into power or privilege, he has climbed by grit, discipline, and sheer force of will. Marius embodies the soldier's virtues. He eats with his men, marches with them, punishes them when needed, but rewards them handsomely for loyalty. To the rank and file, he is not a distant patrician, but one of their own. To his rivals in the Senate, he is dangerous precisely because he does not follow their ancient traditions. Faced with disaster, Marius makes a choice that will preserve Rome in the short term and unravel it in the long term. He abolishes the property requirement for military service, opening the legions to the poorest citizens, the so-called capite censi, the head count. For these men, landless and destitute, the army is salvation. They are armed and equipped at the state's expense, drilled into unbreakable professionals, and promised rewards at the end of their service. On the battlefield, it is brilliant. Suddenly, Rome has a vast reservoir of manpower ready to be forged into steel. In strategic terms, Marius has solved the Republic's pressing weakness. But the hidden danger is immense. These new soldiers have nothing to tie them back to the Republic except their general's word. They cannot rely on the Senate's corrupt promises of land and compensation, so they turn instead to their commander, who has armed them, fed them, trained them, and promised them everything. Marius, without realizing it, has shifted the soldiers' loyalty from the Roman state to the Roman general. This single change will echo down the generations, ensuring that men like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar can hold Rome's fate in their hands. The system that once balanced civic duty with military obligation is shattered. Rome's republican identity is fraying. The poor, once excluded from service, now see the army as their profession. The aristocracy, once secure in its monopoly over political and military power, now finds that popularity with common soldiers can vault someone like Marius above them. Military victories become the fastest way to political domination. Already the whispers grow. Why listen endlessly to the Senate's debates when one strong man, backed by his hardened legions, can decide Rome's future with the point of a gladius? Marius's own life mirrors this transformation. Once a promising outsider, his victories in Africa and against the Germanic tribes make him a hero, elected consul no fewer than 7 times. The people see him as Rome's savior, but his rise triggers rivalries, most notably with another ambitious commander, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their feud will explode into civil war only a generation later, with soldiers marching against their own capital for the first time in history. When Caesar finally crosses the Rubicon decades later, he is not inventing treason. He is following a precedent written in blood when Marius opened the gates. The grim irony is that Marius must have believed he was preserving the Republic. He was responding to a military crisis that seemed unsolvable. Consider his dilemma: keep to tradition, refuse to arm the poor, and risk Rome being torn apart by the Cimbri and Jugurtha, or bend tradition, recruit a professional army from the landless masses, and save Rome's external empire, even at the cost of its political soul. What would you have done in his place? Would you preserve custom and let Rome collapse? Or improvise, knowing that improvisation would prove deadly in the long run? This is the dilemma at the heart of Rome's transformation. The Marian Reforms are not just about reorganizing legionary equipment, standardizing training, or adopting new marching practices. They represent the collapse of a centuries-old political balance, replacing it with something new, something far more dangerous. Rome gains the professional soldier, disciplined, hardened, endlessly loyal to his general. In that instant, the Republic places its survival in the hands of individuals over institutions. The countdown to empire begins. And so the story of Marius is more than military reform. It is the story of how pressure from foreign war forced a constitutional revolution at home. Marius saved Rome on the battlefield, but he also destroyed the old Republic. His reforms enabled extraordinary victories, yet every triumph carried with it the shadow of civil war to come. Rome had traded tradition for survival. Soon it would pay the price. If we want to understand why this gamble worked so well at first and why it proved so dangerous, we need to look closely at what Rome's armies were like before Marius took his gamble. What was this legendary military machine, the legions, that had conquered Carthage and Greece? Why did it start to break down? And why did Marius's new model of professional soldiers seem like the only way forward? The answers lie in the foundations of Rome's military system, the structure, discipline, and tactics that had built an empire. Foundations that, by Marius's time, had begun to crumble. Why did the Roman military machine dominate the ancient world for centuries when rival states collapsed again and again? To answer that, we must examine the nature of the legion before Marius, because only by seeing its power and its limitations can we understand why reform became necessary, and why this change ultimately transformed Rome's destiny. For most of Rome's rise, the legion stood as the most disciplined and adaptable military system the world had ever seen. Unlike the rigid Greek phalanx, where dense ranks of spearmen presented a wall of pikes but struggled to maneuver, the Roman manipular legion was flexible. Infantry were divided into maniples, small blocks of roughly 120 men. Hastati, the youngest soldiers, formed the front. Principes, older and wealthier, the second line. Triarii, veterans armed with long spears, served as a hardened third line. Behind them stood the velites, light infantry skirmishers, who harassed the enemy with javelins before withdrawing. This system was designed for citizen soldiers, particularly farmers who had to fund their own equipment. The wealthy brought better armor, the poor brought lighter gear. But together they formed Rome's citizen army. It was built to fight short, sharp wars near home, not endless campaigns across seas. Discipline was its heartbeat. Roman soldiers drilled constantly, practicing thrusts with the gladius, throwing the pilum, advancing and retreating in formation. Centurions enforced discipline with ferocity, punishing cowardice with death, rewarding courage with honor. Tents were arranged with mathematical precision in nightly marching camps, built and fortified even after grueling marches. a practice that wore men down but kept them prepared. Archaeological remains of marching camps across Europe and North Africa still bear silent witness to this relentless routine. No other ancient army produced such consistent order in the chaos of war. As Polybius, a Greek historian who studied Rome carefully, marveled, the Roman army was a machine of endurance, its strength lying as much in organization as in weapons. Weapons themselves added to this dominance. Chief among them was the gladius, the short stabbing sword that turned close combat into a butcher's work. In training, recruits were taught to thrust rather than slash, less dramatic but far deadlier, since a thrust pierced vital organs behind shields. The pilum, the heavy Roman javelin, was another stroke of military genius. Designed to bend on impact, it disrupted enemy shields, making them useless and created openings for the charge. Archaeological finds of pila heads, distorted into contorted shapes, demonstrate this clever design. Combined with the curved scutum shield, overlapping to form protective walls, Roman infantry became a flexible killing engine. The legion's greatest advantage, however, lay in its adaptability. While the phalanx lurched forward like a single block, vulnerable to flanking, the Roman manipular structure allowed sections of men to rotate, advance, and retreat in stages. When Hannibal annihilated Roman armies in the Punic Wars, it was through brilliant strategy, not the superiority of Carthaginian infantry. When properly led, the legion recovered, absorbed defeats, and returned stronger. In Spain, Numantia fell to Roman persistence. In Greece, the phalanx was broken by superior maneuver. In Africa, Carthage burned because Roman discipline outlasted everything in its path. But by the late 2nd century BCE, this machine was starting to break. The manipular structure relied on property classes to sort soldiers into their roles. Yet centuries of war had devastated the small farmer. Wealthy elites accumulated estates run by slave labor, while the poor flooded to Rome or drifted into unemployment. The Republic's once vast pool of eligible soldiers shrank alarmingly. Men who should have been training for the legion were now dispossessed, unable to even afford the gear to enlist. The infantry classes thinned at precisely the moment when Rome's wars exploded in scale. The Senate, clinging to tradition, failed to grasp this looming strategic disaster. Many senators enriched themselves with provincial wealth while leaving the state vulnerable. Recruitment became harder each year. The defeats at Arausio in 105 BCE showed that Rome, for all its wealth, could not field an army capable of handling foreign threats. Imagine Rome as a great machine with gleaming gears that once meshed perfectly, now rusting because the parts no longer fit. Still, the army itself remained an incredible instrument when it could be filled. Consider its tactical mindset. Engagements were carefully calculated. Throw pila, close with gladii, press with shields, rotate lines. Roman commanders thought in terms of grinding endurance, not short charges. The legion specialized in wearing down enemies with discipline. Picture the Cimbri, rushing in waves with terrifying roars, meeting wall after wall of glinting shields and stabbing swords, each line of Romans fresh, while the barbarians tired. It was not glamorous riposte, but it was relentless. This methodical slaughter won Rome empire after empire. Logistics cemented Rome's superiority. Roads built across Italy and later across the provinces were not just for trade, they were arteries for legions. Grain, weapons, reinforcements, all moved swiftly. Soldiers often carried heavy loads themselves, earning the nickname Marius's mules, though that phrase would take shape after the reforms. Even so, the old legions demanded endurance. Archaeology has shown us traces of supply depots along Roman routes, the bones of pack animals, remnants of standardized weaponry. Rome made war scientific in a way others had not yet imagined. Yet beneath this brilliance lay seeds of fragility. Success and conquest had ironically undermined the social base of the army, with the poor unable to meet equipment requirements and the rich making up a smaller fraction of the population. Legions became harder to raise. The very flexibility of the manipular system could not save it if the pool of citizen soldiers dried up. Picture a war machine that had conquered Carthage and Greece, suddenly gasping for manpower even as new enemies approached. Here is where the strategic question arises. Should Rome have maintained its old citizen soldier army, knowing it no longer had the numbers? Or should it have broken with tradition, creating a professional military whose loyalty might not lie with the Republic? The senators could not decide. They clung to their privileges, refused reform, and allowed catastrophe to loom. It is easy to admire the Legion's perfection in abstract. Its formations impressed allies and terrified enemies. Its camps stood like cities built overnight. Its commanders thought not just of victories, but of endurance across decades. Yet soldiers were still men, not machines. They bled, hungered, and felt despair. By the 2nd century BCE, these men often returned to find their farms gone, their families ruined, and their sacrifices unrecognized. Their discipline in war was unmatched, but their political loyalty to the Republic was eroding. It was only a matter of time before someone exploited that. Consider what you would have done as a soldier. You fight 3 years in Spain, marching hundreds of miles, taking cities under endless siege. You survive, return home, and discover you no longer have property because wealthy aristocrats seized your land. You are poorer than before, broken by war, abandoned by the state. Who would you follow next time? The Senate that left you destitute, or the general who promises you wages, plunder, and a farm after service? This disillusionment explains why Marius's reforms took root. The Legion as it had been, though tactically brilliant, was unsustainable socially. Rome could no longer muster armies the old way without tearing its society apart. The Manipular Legion was a tool designed for the Republic of smallholders. That republic was gone. The army, therefore, had to change with it. And here lies the paradox. The Roman military machine, the pride of the Republic, was at once too strong and too weak. It was tactically unbeatable when filled and loyal, but structurally unsustainable when its recruiting pool collapsed. The weapons, the training, the tactics, all still worked, but the Republic could no longer supply its most important resource. Men who believed their service tied them to the state. Marius responded to this weakness, but his fix would unleash consequences no one could contain. So the Legion before Marius should not just be remembered as a disciplined war machine. It was also an entire political order in miniature, reflecting Rome's values in shield and sword. It represented a partnership between state and citizen, wealth and duty, sacrifice and reward. When that balance failed, the system itself could no longer function. And it was this failure that gave Marius his opening, his chance to reforge the legions into something new. An army of professionals, armed by the state, bound by loyalty not to the Republic, but to the man who made them. The brilliance and the decay are inseparable. Rome's legendary Manipular legions could conquer the world, but could not survive Rome itself. And that, more than anything, explains why the reforms were not just useful, but inevitable. To see their consequences in vivid action, we now move toward the moment where they were tested in blood, on the battlefield itself, where Marius's new model army would face its greatest challenge against the Cimbri and Teutones, in a contest that would determine whether Rome lived or died. Why did a single battle in southern Gaul echo so loudly across Roman history? Why was its victory hailed as salvation, yet its consequences quietly set the Republic on a path to collapse? To answer that, we turn to the clash at Aquae Sextiae in 102 BCE, when Gaius Marius's newly reformed legions faced the terrifying might of the Teutons, a clash not just of armies, but of systems. By the time Marius marched into southern Gaul, Rome had already endured catastrophe. The memory of Arausio in 105 BCE still lingered like a festering wound. On that disastrous day, Roman arrogance and incompetence led two generals to field rival armies that refused to cooperate. The result was annihilation. Tens of thousands of Roman citizens lay dead on foreign soil, their armor stripped, their standards captured, their prestige ruined. The Cimbri and their Teutonic allies seemed unstoppable, like an unstoppable tide descending upon Italy. To Roman ears, their howls were no different from the shrieks of doom. Citizens whispered of another Hannibal, another Cannae, another republic on the edge of death. In this moment of terror, Marius took command. Consul for the 4th time, he understood that Rome was not just facing an enemy army, but a migration, a flood of people, warriors mixed with wives, children, wagons, and oxen. To defeat them, he needed not only military strength, but patience, cunning, and the full support of his reforms. Thus, somewhere near modern Aix-en-Provence, he prepared his new army to meet the Teutons in battle. The stakes could not have been higher. If Rome failed here, northern Italy lay exposed. Whole provinces could collapse, allies desert, and the Senate itself might crumble in panic. Everything rested on Marius's decision, and he knew exactly what was at stake. He was not just fighting for Republican survival, he was fighting for perpetual glory as Rome's savior. Strategically, Aquae Sextiae was not a random point of intersection. Marius deliberately chose the high ground above a river trap. Facing an enemy that vastly outnumbered him, he understood the importance of terrain. The Teutons, confident in their size and reckless ferocity, marched directly toward Rome's position. They taunted Marius's troops, shouting and jeering, calling them cowards for refusing open battle. But Marius was no fool. He would not risk the fate of the Republic in a reckless charge. Instead, he ordered his troops to hold the high ground, fortify their positions, and prepare. This patience infuriated the enemy. For days, the Teutons tried to provoke a fight. They marched past the Roman camp, mocking the soldiers, claiming they would soon be slaves and wives of their warriors. Roman soldiers, many of them poor men recruited after Marius's reforms, seethed with anger. They wanted release. They wanted their chance. Marius, however, forced them to wait, teaching them the discipline that would turn their fury into deadly focus. Consider the strategic brilliance here. By denying combat until he chose, Marius turned enemy arrogance into overextension. When the time came, it was sudden and decisive. As the Teutones moved near the Roman position, Marius unleashed his trap. He had secretly positioned an ambush force on the enemy's flank, hidden by terrain. As the Teutons surged upward in waves, desperate to dislodge the Romans from the hill, they met with a rain of pila, crashing into their shields, bending them, rendering them useless. The disciplined legionaries advanced in tight formation, stabbing with their gladii, shield wall pressing forward. At that exact moment, the hidden Roman force struck from the side, collapsing the Teutonist formation into chaos. The result was a massacre. Thousands upon thousands of Teutonic warriors were slaughtered in the riverbed and on the slopes. Their war cries turned to screams of despair under the relentless thrusting of Roman blades. Many tried to flee, some drowned in their desperate attempt to escape. Roman discipline and ambush had overcome sheer numbers. According to ancient sources, up to 100,000 Teutons were killed or captured, their women taken in chains, their proud warriors scattered to the winds. It was one of the most complete defeats in Rome's history. Yet within this overwhelming victory lies the essence of Marius's innovation. His army had been drawn from the poor, men who would never have been admitted into earlier legions. Armed by the state, welded together under brutal training, they fought with a ferocity born of desperation and loyalty, not to the Republic, but to Marius himself. Many believed that without his leadership and reforms, they would have had no share in the glory of Rome at all. Their survival, their land, their future rewards would all come from his hand. It is worth pausing here and asking, what would you have done as one of Marius's soldiers? You are landless, homeless. You've been armed by a general who promises you future spoils. Your duty no longer links directly to the Senate, which ignored your poverty, but to the man who lifted you up and gave you purpose. You march through Gaul, starve by his side, endure endless drills at his command, and then, when the battle comes, you win the greatest victory of your lifetime. To whom would you give your loyalty? To faceless senators in togas, or to the man who has delivered you glory? For Rome, the consequences of Aquae Sextiae were immediate and ecstatic. Panic turned to elation. In the streets of Rome, Marius was lauded as the third founder of Rome after Romulus and Camillus. For the common people, he was more than consul. He was salvation. Statues, honors, songs of praise, all declared him the man who had saved the Republic at its darkest moment. But beneath the celebrations lay darker truths. The victory consolidated a dangerous precedent, an army made up of men devoted personally to one general, not to the government. Without Marius to control them, how long until such men turned their fury upon Rome itself? Indeed, the later century would see exactly that. Sulla's soldiers storming the city, Caesar crossing the Rubicon, generals wielding armies like political clubs. The battlefield itself also revealed another theme. Marius had shown uncanny strategic patience. His refusal to engage in rash combat reflected the discipline he drilled into his new model army. He used terrain, deception, and calculated endurance to crush an opponent who relied on numbers and ferocity. Archaeologists today suggest the Roman site reveals layers of makeshift fortifications, evidence of camps strategically placed along river crossings. Combined with literary accounts, these remains confirm what the ancient historians stressed. Marius outthought his opponent as much as he outfought him. Even the slaughter itself carried moral consequences. Some ancient writers claim that Teutonic women, captured by Roman soldiers, begged for death rather than slavery, strangling their children and killing themselves when denied. Whether exaggerated or not, the tale underscores the harsh reality of Rome's victories. For every triumph of arms, there were cultural tragedies. Rome reaped glory, but it also trafficked in human suffering. This dichotomy brings us to the peculiar nature of Roman success. Marius had saved Rome, yet each battlefield triumph produced a deeper political wound. His reforms had worked perfectly under his command. But what would happen when others followed his model? When different generals armed the poor and promised them land? Aquae Sextiae, though a miracle of victory, also echoed like a warning bell. Rome's survival now depended not on the Senate's management, but on whichever general controlled the loyalty of the professionalized legions. Strategically, Aquae Sextiae is as important as Cannae or Pharsalus, not for its scale alone, but for its demonstration of a new Roman army. From here on out, legions would be permanent professionals. They would march as Marius's mules, carrying their standardized packs, loyal for decades of service. The Roman war machine had been refined, sharpened, professionalized. It would be this military order that carried Roman eagles across the Rhine, into Iberia, across the sands of North Africa, and even beyond into Parthia. Yet for Rome's internal politics, this new engine was a double-edged sword. The victory also transformed Marius personally. Unparalleled in glory, he leaned further into politics, clashing more bitterly with his senatorial rivals. Already, enmity between himself and Sulla was brewing, a feud that would soon split the Republican blood. Aquae Sextiae had given him the legitimacy to rival any aristocrat, but it had also planted envy in others. And Rome's politics, fragile as pottery, cracked under the strain. So Aquae Sextiae must be seen both as salvation and devastation. It saved Rome's borders from annihilation, restored confidence in its armies, and gave the Republic breathing space after Arausio. But it also entrenched the Marian Reforms as permanent. The poor would forevermore serve as Rome's professional fighting class. Their generals, not the Senate, would be their benefactors, and within that relationship lay the fall of the Republic. The glory of Aquae Sextiae is undeniable, yet as history shows, the real consequence of victory is often hidden in its shadows. The army that won so brilliantly for Marius would, in later decades, bleed Rome itself in civil war. The trap Marius set for the Teutones thus mirrors the trap Rome had sprung on itself. By surviving the barbarians, the Republic set itself on the path to its own destruction. And as the Senate celebrated and Mario basked in triumph, the real test loomed ahead. For soon, politics in Rome would grow more poisonous. Rivals would rise, alliances would fracture, and generals would use their armies against their fellow citizens. To understand how this unfolds, we must now turn from the battlefield to the Senate chamber, where daggers were sharp, conspiracies brewed, and ambition became a weapon every bit as deadly as a gladius. Why did Rome's generals, who had sworn to protect the state, end up turning their armies against it? Why did the Senate, once the commanding brain of the Republic, find itself increasingly sidelined? To explore this, we have to move from the battlefield to politics, where ambition, rivalry, and betrayal would prove every bit as deadly as swords and spears. If Aquae Sextiae had saved the Republic from external enemies, the maneuvers that followed would begin to doom it from within. After his spectacular victory over the Teutones in 102 BCE, Marius was at the height of his fame. He was hailed in Rome as a savior, the man who had preserved the Republic. This status was impossible to ignore. Yet in a republic built on checks, balances, and the wary jealousy of aristocrats, unrestrained glory was politically dangerous. The Senate, dominated by ancient patrician families, despised Marius not just for his power, but for what he represented. A new man, a novus homo who had risen not by ancestry, but through military genius. To them, his victories were almost an insult, proof that the Republic's social hierarchy could be bypassed by sheer ability. The Senate had always sought to control military power by limiting command. No man was meant to dominate by force of arms for too long. But Marius broke precedent. He was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, often consecutively. This revealed both his popularity with the people and the desperation of the Republic, which continued to face foreign threats. For the aristocrats, this was deeply unsettling. Here was a general whose genius was reinforced by enormous popular support. What stopped him from making himself Rome's absolute master? At the center of tensions were the growing divisions between two political factions, the optimates and the populares. The optimates, or best men, represented the conservative aristocratic senatorial elite. They sought to preserve tradition, the authority of the Senate, and the privileges of the wealthy. Across from them were the populares, who appealed more directly to the Roman masses, using popular assemblies to push reforms against senatorial obstruction. The Republic had always survived on a fragile balance between these forces. But now, with armies at stake, the balance was shifting toward chaos. Marius leaned toward the populares. He allied himself with tribunes and equestrians, Rome's middle order, to push through reforms such as land distributions for veterans. Not because he was a natural champion of the people, but because the Senate was filled with aristocratic rivals who sought to obstruct him. Here lies the irony. Marius, a general more comfortable in the field than in political maneuvering, was boxed into being a popularist by senatorial hostility. His enemies forced him into the position of champion for the masses, a role which only intensified political polarization. Fear began to spread in the Senate. They remembered the fate of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, the reformist brothers murdered for daring to challenge senatorial dominance. Violence was already a political tool in the Republic, but now violence would be wielded not with gangs of rabble, but with legions of armed, professional soldiers. The rules of politics themselves were beginning to change. Consider the mindset of a senator at this moment. You see Marius, backed by legions of poor veterans whose land and rewards have come directly from him, commanding public love. You fear his ambition, but you also fear challenging him openly, because what if he brings his troops into Rome? You argue in the Senate, but your arguments risk echoing into silence if soldiers are arrayed in the field at his command. What would you do? Seek compromise? Plot quietly to kill him? Support a rival strongman to oppose him? Each option carried dangers that would soon plunge Rome into civil war. Into this volatile landscape entered one of the most consequential figures in Roman history, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In many ways, Sulla was everything Marius was not. Aristocratic, charming, ambitious, and ruthless, he relied less on popular appeal and more on strategic alliances with the Senate's conservative elite. Ironically, it was Marius himself who first provided Sulla with the chance to shine. During the Jugurthine War, when Sulla played a crucial role in capturing Jugurtha through cunning diplomacy and treachery. This victory embittered Marius, because though he remained supreme in command, Sulla received much of the credit. Thus began one of Rome's most bitter rivalries. Their enmity symbolized the deeper conflict tearing at the Republic, the populares versus the optimates, ambition versus tradition, and most importantly, soldier loyalty to a general versus institutional loyalty to the Senate. For a time, both men fought external enemies, but soon they would turn inward, using their armies as pawns in the struggle for Rome itself. Politics in this era became a battlefield where daggers replaced swords. Assassinations were not uncommon. Riots erupted in the Forum. Gangs hired by rival tribunes patrolled the streets. Lawmaking became a cover for power struggles. Land reform bills were violently opposed. Veterans were used as leverage. Even the sanctity of the consulship was undermined by repeated re-elections and blatant manipulation. Archaeologists later identified burned layers beneath sections of the Forum dating to these decades, remnants of the literal street battles that accompanied Rome's decline. The Senate's impotence only worsened with time. Once the guardians of the Republic, senators increasingly looked like petty aristocrats desperate to cling to wealth. Their refusal to enact meaningful reform, their arrogance in ignoring the plight of the poor, and their bitter hostility towards successful outsiders made them easy targets for populist demagogues. For the people of Rome, it was not the Senate that saved them from the Cimbri and Teutonices. It was Marius. It was not the Senate that provided land on discharge. It was their generals. With each passing year, loyalty shifted further away from republican institutions and toward men who commanded the means of violence. Ask yourself, as a Roman at the time, where does your loyalty lie? Do you trust a decaying Senate that sneers at your poverty and corruption? Or do you throw your support behind a victorious general who has risked everything to deliver you safety and rewards? Rome's masses began answering this question with their votes, their money, and eventually their swords. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla would come to its terrifying climax when both vied for command in the Eastern wars against King Mithridates of Pontus, a command that promised glory and riches. The Senate tried to give it to Sulla, but the populares seized on the anger of Marius's veterans and manipulated the assembly to overturn the decision. Sulla responded by doing something unthinkable. He marched his legions not against a foreign enemy, but against Rome itself. When Sulla's soldiers entered the sacred city in 88 BCE, it was a shattering moment for the Republic. Never before had a Roman army violated the taboo of crossing into Rome under arms. Now, with Sulla at their head, his men massacred political opponents, exiled Marius, and forced recognition of his command. The precedent had been set. Generals no longer needed to debate or persuade. They could enforce their will with troops. Marius, however, did not vanish quietly. In one of the most chilling episodes of Roman history, he returned from exile, gathered forces loyal to him, marched into Rome, and unleashed an orgy of bloodshed on Sulla's supporters. Political enemies were hunted down and murdered in the streets. Heads of aristocrats were displayed on the rostra as warnings. Rome itself had become a battleground. The Republic had survived Hannibal, the Cimbri, Jugurtha, but could it survive its own generals? The cycle of violence had begun. From here on, every Roman politician knew that where law failed, force might succeed. Once the taboo of armed capture of Rome was broken, it could never be restored. Successive generations, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, would repeat the pattern until Augustus finally emerged as master of all. The death of the Republic was less a sudden collapse than a gradual bleeding out. Death by 1,000 political knives, sped along by generals commanding armies of loyal professionals. Through it all, the Senate faded further into irrelevance. Their plots, assassinations, and endless obstruction revealed only their own weakness. With each defeat, each moment when soldiers chose to follow generals over laws, the Senate lost its grip. By the time Caesar marched on Rome in 49 BCE, his action was revolutionary, but hardly unprecedented. The road had been paved decades earlier when Marius and Sulla first turned Rome's soldiers inward. The lesson of this political carnage is sobering. Republics do not collapse in silence. They are chipped away, corrupted by greed, poisoned by mistrust, and finally broken when weapons that once defended the state are pointed at its heart. Rome's institutions had always relied on restraint, on shared norms that generals would not seize personal power. Once Marius and Sulla shattered that norm, everything else unraveled. Political intrigue, backroom deals, assassinations. The immediate consequences were dramatic, but the long-term trajectory was clear. The Republic had created, through the Marian Reforms, not just a new army, but a new source of political authority. Whoever commanded that army commanded Rome. Politicians without soldiers became irrelevant. Politicians with soldiers became dangerous. Ask yourself now, if you were a senator with no legion of your own, how would you survive in such a world? How long before you submitted to a stronger man? How long before you plotted, bribed, or betrayed in hopes of riding the coattails of a general? And how long before that general, sensing your weakness, dispensed with the Senate altogether? In the chaos of these power plays, we find the true turning point of Roman history. The reforms that had saved Rome militarily now poisoned it politically. The Republic's fate was sealed, not by foreign spears, but by its own armies, its own leaders, and its inability to control the deadliest force of all, ambition. The battlefield of Aquae Sextiae had shown Rome's salvation. The streets of Rome now revealed its destruction. Civil war had arrived not in theory, but in bloody practice. And to understand just how deeply these transformations reshaped every layer of Roman life, we must look beyond the Senate and the generals, to the ordinary Romans themselves, the soldiers, the citizens, the slaves, and the conquered peoples who bore the weight of this immense transformation. Why did Marius's reforms reshape not only the army, but the very texture of Roman life? Why did ordinary people, from citizen farmers to newly recruited soldiers, from slaves in Italy to subjects abroad, experience Rome so differently after this transformation? If we want to understand why the Republic's collapse felt inevitable, we have to leave behind the Senate's scheming and the roar of battle for a moment and look closer at culture, society, and daily life in the shadow of Rome's wars. At the heart of this story are the new soldiers themselves. Traditionally, legions were composed of land-holding farmers, men who could afford their own shields, helmets, and weapons. Their service tied them to the state. They risked their lives, yet upon return, they still had land to farm, families to provide for, a stake in society. They were warriors because they were citizens. But after the Marian Reforms, the dynamic changed forever. The new recruits were drawn from the capite censi, the head count, the poorest citizens who had no property, often no steady livelihood, sometimes no reason to expect any future. For them, the army was not seasonal duty, but career, identity, and lifeline. The life of these professional soldiers was punishing. Marius demanded the highest discipline. Gone were the long baggage trains that had once carried arms and supplies for citizen soldiers. Now, every man carried his own gear on his back: shield, pilum, gladius, cooking utensils, a few days' worth of rations, stakes for fortifying camps. These burdens earned them a new nickname: Marius's mules. Archaeological discoveries of legionary packs, cooking pots, and marching kits confirmed just how arduous this new standardization was. But while brutal, it created a hardened army capable of astonishing speed and endurance. These men could march 20 miles a day, build a fortified camp, sleep a few hours, and march again. They no longer trudged reluctantly to war. They were war embodied. Daily life for these soldiers meant endless repetition. Drill after drill, march after march, weapons training until muscles burned from exhaustion. They rose with the trumpet, broke camp in orderly lines, cooked their rations in shared messes, and slept in tents of 8 men, contubernia, that forged camaraderie and loyalty. Over time, soldiers began to see their generals not as distant masters, but as paternal figures, providers of land, glory, and security. The Republic, by contrast, seemed absent from their daily lives. It was their general who rewarded them, fed them, allowed them to dream of a farm plot in Italy or a piece of captured wealth abroad. The erosion of loyalty was not instant but subtle, lived out every day in the realities of camp life. But the effects rippled beyond the soldiers themselves. Rome's conquest had brought wealth on an unimaginable scale. Tens of thousands of slaves were imported into Italy every year. Farmers, artisans, prisoners of war, whose forced labor transformed the economy. Large estates, or latifundia, spread across the countryside, owned by wealthy senators and worked by slaves. The small freeholder class, the backbone of the old citizen-soldier model, was disappearing. In their place, Rome grew dependent on both a landless poor class in the city, clamoring for bread and work, and professional soldiers who spent decades under arms. The Marian Reforms were a response to this reality, but they also magnified it. Each soldier recruited from the poor was one less farmer in Italy tending his own land, one more dependent on warfare for survival. Consider the perspective of a Roman citizen in the city. You might be unemployed, reliant on free grain distributions to survive. You watch as senators grow wealthy off provincial exploitation and slaves replace free labor. You begin to resent the Senate, envy those soldiers who return from campaigns with plunder, and look to generals like Marius as your champions. The Republic was meant to balance aristocratic and popular interests, but to the urban poor it increasingly looked like an oligarchy. When generals promised reform, land, or simply revenge against arrogant senators, The crowd listened. The conquered peoples of the provinces felt these pressures as well. For them, Rome's cultural integration was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Rome imposed its language, law, and ways of life. Roman religion mingled with local gods. Roman architecture stamped its authority across cities. Some elites in the provinces eagerly adopted Roman identity, gaining citizenship and privileges in return for loyalty. Others suffered under heavy taxes and harsh governors. For these subjects, the professional legion was both oppressor and symbol of Roman order. Legionary forts and roads, remnants of which we can still see today, became the daily face of empire. Imagine being a Gallic farmer in the shadow of Roman conquest. Rome has defeated your tribe and garrisoned soldiers nearby. At first, you resent their presence as occupiers. But over time, those same soldiers build roads, protect trade routes, and enforce peace. Your children grow up hearing Latin, trading in Roman markets, measuring time by Roman calendars. Slowly, grudgingly, Rome infiltrates your culture. This is cultural conquest, not only won by steel and battle, but by the routine grind of occupation and integration. The reforms also changed class dynamics within Roman society. Rome was increasingly split into three distinctive realities: the senatorial elite, glutted with wealth from empire; the impoverished masses, both rural and urban, struggling for survival; and the soldiers who hovered between, caught in a strange limbo of military life. The Marian Reforms tied these classes together in new ways. Elites depended on generals to protect their interests, while the people depended on generals to survive. Soldiers became the rope binding both, yet pulling Rome toward dangerous dependence on successful commanders. The core paradox of daily life is this: the Marian Reforms provided poor citizens with opportunity, mobility, and a shared identity. A man who might once have begged in the streets of Rome could now emerge as a decorated veteran, rewarded with land, respected in his community, perhaps even upwardly mobile. At the same time, the reforms deepened divides between the classes, because stability for the poor now required wars abroad and leaders at home willing to exploit the republic. War, rather than law, had become the path to dignity for ordinary men. From slaves to citizens, the human cost of this transition was immense. Slaves toiled under harsher conditions on vast estates, their lives crushed by the weight of conquest. Citizens without property fought wars far from home, their reward dependent on a commander's political fortunes. The Senate, increasingly an irrelevant theater of aristocratic privilege, ignored these realities until it was too late. By the late Republic, violence and politics were intertwined because daily life had already radicalized. Armies were tools of politics because soldiers depended on generals for their survival. Ordinary citizens supported strongmen because traditional institutions had abandoned them. Consider what you would have done as a Roman soldier. You march 20 miles a day, labor like a mule, fight battles under iron discipline, survive on meager rations. After years of service, you return to discover the Senate squabbling over your land grant, senators refusing to fund distribution, aristocrats sneering at your sacrifice. But your commander, Marius, Sulla, Caesar, promises you a farm, gold, perhaps even citizenship for your children. Where does your loyalty lie? Laws on brittle parchment, or the commander who has already proven himself in war? The reality of Roman cultural life under the Marian Reforms is not just one of military reorganization. It is a slow reprogramming of society itself. Rome ceases to be a republic of citizen farmers with equal stakes and becomes an empire of professional soldiers, dependent poor, and distant rulers. The Roman war machine produced glory abroad, but unease at home. Archaeological evidence today confirms these shifts. Veteran colonies scattered across Italy show patterns of settlement where discharged soldiers were planted to secure loyalty and pacify regions. Fort remnants across Gaul and Spain reveal standardized layouts from this professionalized army. The distribution of amphorae and coins in provincial towns exhibits the expansion of Roman economic culture. Through these traces, we see how daily life was reshaped not by senatorial decrees, but by military decisions that reverberated across society. And this is the greatest irony of all. The Marian Reforms, celebrated as pragmatic military innovation, were lived by ordinary people as cultural revolution. They redefined what it meant to be a Roman who got to fight Rome's wars, who gained rewards, and whose lives were sacrificed for survival. If in earlier centuries Rome had been a republic defended by its farmers, by now it was an empire defended by its poor and fed by the toil of its slaves. The transformation was total. But transformations always carry breaking points. The soldiers who gave their loyalty to generals would soon be asked to fight not just foreigners, but fellow Romans. The people who supported populist leaders would soon watch rival generals ravage their city. The senators, who thought they could control everything, would soon watch as their power shrank to nothing. The daily life of Rome, bent by reform and conquest, would finally snap under the unbearable tension. The turning point was close. The Marian Reforms had set Rome on a course toward a new military and a new social order. But when these forces collided with the ambitions of men like Sulla and Caesar, Rome itself would descend into civil war. And that descent begins at the very moment loyalty to the Republic gave way to loyalty to commanders. And soldiers were turned not against barbarians, but against Romans themselves. Why did the Republic unravel from the inside, even as its legions stood unconquered abroad? Why was the true crossing of the Rubicon not Caesar's in 49 BCE, but an earlier moment when Lucius Cornelius Sulla, commander of an army forged by the Marian Reforms, marched those very men into Rome itself? To answer that, we must understand how reforms designed to save the Republic from foreign annihilation created the conditions for internal civil wars that would ultimately destroy it. The Marian army was professional, loyal, and unmatched in endurance. But while these qualities had ensured victory at Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae, they had also inverted the Republic's delicate balance. A Roman legionary now depended upon his commander for enlistment, pay, plunder, and, most importantly, land upon retirement. He did not view the Senate as his patron. He did not care for the distant, fractured debates of men in togas who bickered in marble halls while he carried his gladius and scutum through mud, blood, and snow. He cared for his general, and in this loyalty lay Rome's undoing. Marius himself lived long enough to see the consequences. By the late 90s BCE, he had become a towering figure, elected consul 7 times, adored by the masses, loathed by the aristocracy. Yet his star began to dim. Age and illness caught up with him. Younger rivals sought glory. Still his name carried immense weight, enough that he was not willing to surrender gracefully to obscurity. When a new dazzling aristocrat rose to prominence, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the stage was set for disaster. Sulla was ambition personified. Born into a noble family but without great fortune, he cultivated charm, wit, and ruthless pragmatism. During the Jugurthine War, he had snatched the credit for Jugurtha's capture by outmaneuvering Marius diplomatically, stoking the enmity between them. Their rivalry simmered for decades, erupting into lethal conflict when opportunity arose in the east. For in the early 80s BCE, a new enemy appeared, King Mithridates VI of Pontus, a ruler whose bold defiance of Rome threatened to unravel its authority in the Greek East. Whoever commanded the war against Mithridates would secure fame, fortune, and political dominance. The Senate initially granted the command to Sulla, who was then consul. But the populares, still tied to Marius, maneuvered in the assemblies to strip him of it and grant it instead to the aged general. Suddenly Marius, old, desperate, clinging to his past glories, found himself at the center of another storm. Sulla, robbed of the most prestigious war command of his generation, faced humiliation. For him, the choice was stark: accept political defeat or act with violence unprecedented in Republican history. He chose violence. In 88 BCE, Sulla stunned the world by doing the unthinkable. He turned to his army, professional soldiers shaped by Marian Reforms, and appealed directly for their loyalty. Imagine their perspective. Sulla was promising them riches from campaigns in the east, land grants upon victory, a general's personal attention. Senators in Rome might try to strip Sulla of command, but these soldiers owed nothing to those senators. They owed everything to their general. And so, for the first time in Roman history, an army marched not against foreign barbarians or rival states, but against their own capital. Sulla's march on Rome was more than a military maneuver. It was a political earthquake. Legionaries, disciplined veterans of campaigns against Italy's enemies, now advanced through the sacred streets of their own city. Chaos erupted. Senators fled in terror. Popularist leaders who opposed Sulla were slaughtered, their heads displayed as gruesome trophies. Marius himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing into exile, an exhausted old man carrying his bitterness abroad. The Republic had crossed a threshold it could never uncross. Armies could now decide politics. Generals could impose law with steel, and the Senate's supremacy was shattered. Consider the sheer magnitude of this shift. For centuries, the Roman elite had boasted of their state's resilience, its stability compared with Greek democracies that dissolved under tyrants, or Macedonian monarchies that collapsed in feuds. Rome had institutions, the Senate, the magistrates, the assemblies. But once soldiers pledged their lives to a man, not to the state, those institutions became little more than marble shells, hollow without power. With Sulla's march, the Republic had effectively surrendered command of its destiny to whichever general commanded the most loyal veterans. But the story did not end here. Marius, though aged, was not finished. In one of the most chilling resurgences in Roman history, he clawed his way back. When Sulla departed east to fight Mithridates, Marius returned from exile, gathered supporters, and stormed back into Rome. What followed was a nightmare. The old general unleashed vengeance on his enemies, proscribing aristocrats, slaughtering rivals, and decorating the forum with severed heads. The blood of Roman senators stained the stones that had once been sanctified by law and tradition. Here was the Republic laid bare, its laws eviscerated by swords, its order turned into massacre. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla was more than personal hatred. It was the embodiment of the Republic's fatal transformation. Soldiers were no longer an impartial instrument of the state, but the private tools of ambitious men. When Marius and Sulla fought, Rome itself bled. By the time both men were dead, Marius succumbing to age and Sulla dying not by violence but illness, the Republic was mortally wounded. Their precedent had proven what was possible, and others would follow. Pompey, Crassus, Caesar. The age of men, not institutions, had begun. Step back and see the strategic perspective. What had begun as a practical solution to a manpower shortage now unleashed systemic collapse. Marius's reforms had been rational, even necessary. Without them, Rome might have fallen at Arausio or Equae Sextia, yet by changing soldier recruitment, he had unwittingly severed the bond between army and state. Now wars were fought not only against foreigners, but for political control. And once Rome's strongest pillar, the army, belonged to individuals, all other pillars cracked. The psychological impact on Roman society was enormous. Ordinary citizens now recognized that elections, Senate votes, and tribunician speeches mattered far less than the intentions of generals. Soldiers recognized that success and reward came from backing a dominant commander, even against legal authority. Aristocrats recognized that survival meant aligning with power, abandoning principle. Every class of Roman society absorbed this lesson, and there was no going back. One might ask, could it have been otherwise? Suppose the Senate had embraced reform earlier, redistributing land, easing class tensions, ensuring that soldiers were integrated into the Republic instead of divorced from it. Perhaps loyalty might have endured. Perhaps armies might have remained tied to the people's state rather than to powerful individuals. But history unfolded differently. The Senate clung to privilege, Marius acted out of military necessity, and Sulla demonstrated the final consequence of this shift. Consider again the strategic dilemma for Sulla himself. If you are him, consul of Rome, stripped of Eastern command by political maneuvering, what do you do? Accept humiliation? Watch your rival take the greatest opportunity of your generation? Or appeal to your army, loyal, desperate for land and plunder, and use them to enforce your rightful command? What would you risk? And what would you sacrifice? Sulla's choice illustrates the terrifying logic of military politics. Once the precedent existed, no ambitious man could afford not to seize it. This was the turning point. Rome had lost its monopoly on legitimate power. The state no longer armed and commanded freely. It competed with generals. The very reforms that had preserved it from annihilation now guaranteed it would never return to republican balance. The legacy of this moment reverberates through the century to come. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE was merely an echo of Sulla's precedents. Octavian's seizure of power after killing Antony was merely a continuation of the cycle. Rome's civil wars, stretching for decades, all stemmed from this one essential truth. Marius had created an army that owed everything to generals, and Sulla had taught those generals how to use it against Rome itself. The Republic was not yet officially dead. Senators still met, consuls still held elections, assemblies still voted. But these were ceremonies, shadows of an order already hollowed out. In reality, Rome's future rested in the hands of competing generals commanding professional soldiers. Battles would decide what laws stood, not votes. Ambition would dictate destiny, not tradition. And so, from the deserts of Numidia to the hills of Aquae Sextiae, the Marian Reforms had saved Rome from enemies abroad. But in the bloodied streets of Rome itself, under Sulla's march and Marius's revenge, they revealed their fatal cost. Rome had crossed its true Rubicon long before Caesar made his dramatic gesture in 49 BCE. With Sulla's march in 88 BCE, the Republic's decline had become irreversible. The turning point had come, and Rome itself was both saved and doomed by the same hand. The field of battle was no longer in Gaul or Africa or Greece. It was the Forum, the Senate, the city of Rome itself. And from that moment forward, civil war was not exception, but expectation. Why did the greatest republic of the ancient world collapse into monarchy, even as its armies marched undefeated across 3 continents? Why did a political system that had defeated Hannibal in Carthage and conquered Greece and Africa fail to survive its own expansion? The answer lies in the unintended consequences of the Marian Reforms and the brutal precedents set by Sulla's march. Rome gained an unstoppable army, but it lost the one thing that made it strong: the balance between citizen, general, and state. The reverberations of this failure shaped not only Rome's destiny, but the political imagination of the centuries that followed. The immediate consequence was a century scarred by civil war. Sulla's bold move of turning an army against Rome shattered all restraint. If he could march on the capital and bend its politics by the sword, so could others. And they did. After Sulla's retirement and death, Rome lurched into fresh chaos as ambitious men exploited his precedent. Pompey and Crassus raised personal armies. Catiline conjured conspiracy in the city. And above all, Julius Caesar, military genius, populist politician, and Marius's own nephew by marriage, emerged as the ultimate inheritor of this new world, marching across the Rubicon and ending the Republic for good. From a military standpoint, the professionalization of the legions was revolutionary. No longer rooted in property requirements, the new soldier was bound by a lifetime of service, daily discipline, and expectation of reward. Strategically, these soldiers were unmatched in history. They could march farther, fight longer, and endure with more discipline than any force before them. Their fortresses, still visible in Britain and the Rhine frontier, demonstrate their permanence. Archaeological digs at sites like Caerleon or Vindolanda reveal writing tablets, shoe remnants, letters home, and standardized weapons that testify to an army woven into the fabric of daily life. This was not just war. This was occupation, empire, civilization carried on the backs of soldiers. The professional legion was Rome's greatest innovation. But politically, it was a nightmare, because every professional soldier's survival depended not on the Senate, but on his general. Loyalty to the Republic was dissolved. Roman politics transformed into a vicious cycle. Generals armed the poor followed their generals. Generals marched armies into politics. Politics collapsed back into violence. The Republic had designed its system to resist monarchy. Instead, through reforms, it created generals who wielded more power than kings. Ask yourself, what lesson did this teach ambitious men? Once the taboo was shattered, what choice did Pompey or Caesar have except to use their armies as political weapons? When your rivals used legions to advance careers, refusing to do the same meant irrelevance. And so the dominoes fell. Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, Antony, Octavian. Each one built upon Marius's template. Each one used soldiers to enforce will. And each step dragged the Republic closer to monarchy disguised as necessity. The social consequences were no less dramatic. The Marian Reform completed the long erosion of Rome's smallholder class. The farmer citizen, Once the heart of Republican virtue gave way to the professionalized soldier for hire, Rome's streets filled with impoverished veterans, often embittered when promised land never came. Colonies of discharged soldiers cropped up across Italy and the provinces, forcing provincial peoples to assimilate or resent their new Roman neighbors. The poor, meanwhile, grew more dependent on bread distributions and spectacles, the infamous breads and circuses, while despising the senatorial elite as corrupt and aloof. Culturally, the Marian Reforms accelerated Rome's transformation into an imperial system. Conquered peoples were no longer temporary subjects. They were embedded into a professional system of governance enforced by legions. Roads stretched further, colonies spread Roman architecture, baths, theaters, and laws. Latin seeped into the languages of Europe. Roman citizenship itself became both carrot and reward, handed out in wider concentric circles to secure loyalty. What began as a reform to allow the poor of Rome to serve gradually created an empire where Italians and eventually provincials filled the ranks of the legions. By the time of Caracalla in the 3rd century CE, citizenship would be extended to virtually all free inhabitants across the empire. The long arc of Roman integration traces back to Marius's fateful decision. It would be easy to imagine these were only ancient concerns, but the lessons carry into modernity. Any republic or democracy must wrestle with the balance between civil authority and military power. Rome demonstrates the danger when that balance is lost. When the state fails to uphold its promises to soldiers, generals fill the void. When institutions cannot maintain legitimacy, charismatic leaders bound to armies ascend. And when those leaders grow too powerful, republics become empires. There is another lesson equally sharp. The Marian Reforms succeeded. They did solve the problem. They enabled Rome to annihilate the Cimbri, to dominate the Mediterranean, to project power for centuries. But victory carries hidden costs. Rome's military supremacy bought temporary security while planting seeds of long-term fragility. Great powers of every age face the same trap. To prepare for survival against outside threats, they adopt policies that eventually corrode the inside. For Rome, it was professional armies. For modern states, it might be different tools, different institutions, but the principle is the same. Short-term survival can produce long-term weakness if political order cannot withstand the changes. Archaeology shines a final, sobering light on these consequences. Excavations in Roman camps reveal a world of order and standardization. Identical barracks, rows of hearths, countless fragments of equipment. Everywhere we look, we see proof of the professionalized army's reach. Contrast this with the archaeological record of the Roman Forum in the early 1st century BCE. Charred earth, hasty rebuilds, evidence of violent clashes. The material culture itself tells a story. Legions grew into perfected machines, while the civic core convulsed in chaos. Rome became militarily invincible, yet politically fragile. What emerges most powerfully is irony. Marius wanted to save Rome. He succeeded. The Republic might not have survived the Cimbri, the Teutones, or Mithridates without his innovation. But in solving one crisis, he created another. The state's survival against barbarian invasion ensured its collapse into the hands of its own generals. The Republic was slain not by a foreign invasion, but by the reforms that let it live. And yet, from this collapse came something enduring: the empire. From Augustus onward, Rome became a monarchy in all but name, cloaked in republican forms but wielding imperial power. It was sustained by legions, professional soldiers whose loyalty was to the emperor. The Senate survived, yes, but as a shadow, a ceremonial organ in a system where the true authority rested on military loyalty. The Marian Reforms built this empire, unintentionally but decisively. Consider once more the soldier's voice. A poor man recruited in the late Republic, hardened under Marius or Sulla, loyal to Caesar or Pompey, his life tells the story of Rome. Born into poverty, given Roman arms and training, rewarded in land and loot, his destiny bound to his general. His victories are Rome's conquests. His loyalties are Rome's undoing. His descendants populate colonies across Europe, spreading Roman culture and law. And ultimately, the professional soldier created by reform becomes the foundation stone of empire. This is the paradox at the heart of the Marian Reforms. They saved Rome to destroy the Republic, but in doing so, they built the empire that shaped Western civilization. The long shadow of this choice stretched across centuries. Europe's frontiers, provincial boundaries, even its languages and laws, bear the imprint of professional legions first called forth by Marius. Rome's republic ended not in glory, but in civil war and dictatorship. And yet, through its empire, it bequeathed institutions, culture, and legal traditions still alive in our modern world. Those who built the reforms could not have imagined the magnitude of what they unleashed. But history is not kind to intentions. It records only consequences. And the consequences of the Marian reforms were nothing less than the destruction of the Republic and the birth of the empire. Why did Marius's reforms matter so deeply? Why does the story of a general in the late 2nd century BCE still shape the way we think about republics, armies, and power today? The answer lies not only in battles won or political struggles endured, but in the enduring question: who does a soldier serve, the state or the man who commands him? The way Rome answered that question is the way it lost the Republic. We have traced the story from the deserts of Numidia to the hills of Aquae Sextia, from the bloodstains of the Forum to the battle lines of Sulla's civil war. At every stage, the same theme emerges. The Marian reforms were a necessary response to crisis. Rome's old system of farmer-citizen soldiers had collapsed. Enemies pressed hard. Manpower collapsed. And without reform, the Republic might very well have vanished. Marius opened the army to the poor, armed them at state expense, and welded them into the most formidable professional soldiers the ancient world had yet seen. The result was salvation on the battlefield and ruin in the Forum. What began as military innovation became political revolution. A farmer soldier owed his loyalty to the Republic because his land, his family, and his rights sustained him. But a landless recruit, armed by his general and promised land upon victory, owed loyalty not to law, but to a man. Once that bond shifted, the generals, not the Senate, became the arbiters of Roman politics. From Marius to Sulla, Caesar to Augustus, the trajectory was clear. The Republic was already doomed the moment its armies ceased to belong to institutions and instead belonged to individuals. And yet, out of this collapse came the empire. The professional legion, disciplined, enduring, loyal, became the backbone of Rome's imperial power for centuries. The empire that conquered Britain, secured the Rhine, dominated Spain, and encircled the Mediterranean, was forged in the reforms of Gaius Marius. Without him, Rome might have collapsed in the face of the Cimbri. With him, it gained centuries of supremacy, even as political liberty withered away. The story carries powerful modern echoes. The balance between civil authority and military loyalty remains a delicate one in every republic and democracy today. When armies become politicized, when generals cultivate loyalty beyond institutions, when soldiers feel more loyalty to charismatic leaders than to constitutions, history warns us of the outcome. Rome offers the cautionary tale. Once the sword enters politics, law and tradition break down. There is another lesson too, one rooted in irony. The Marian reforms did what they intended. They solved the problem of manpower, saved Rome, and established military supremacy. But by doing so, they created new dynamics the Republic could not contain. This tension between short-term survival and long-term sustainability is one shared by many states. Policies that save in crisis often unravel stability later. Rome's history urges us to look not only at immediate victory, but also at what those victories reshape beneath the surface.